Hello, everyone, and welcome to McLaughlin College Union's second debate of the academic year. Today, we'll be debating the question of artificial intelligence as an existential risk. But before we get started, allow me to read the land acknowledgement. This meeting is virtual, and because of that, we are not actually gathered in the same space. York's land acknowledgement might not represent the territory that you are currently on. And I would ask, if that is the case, that each of you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tookarondo has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'd like to start by providing some context to today's debate. Waterloo's Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, has a series titled Modern Conflict and AI that I'd like to recommend to everyone. And in one of the articles, Meg King and Aaron Schull have asked, how can policymakers predict the unpredictable, referring specifically to AI, that they liken to electricity or electric power that changed the world? AI, they note, is a general purpose technology, GPT, that has many applications across a variety of sectors. They also go on to argue when technology can learn itself, think for itself, when combined with autonomous robotics, ultimately do for itself, the challenges become complex. Needless to say, the governance challenges of AI are enormous. A BBC News report in December of 2014 notes that Professor Stephen King, the renowned theoretical physicist, stated that the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. Likewise, technology entrepreneur and the chief executive of SpaceX, Elon Musk, has also warned that AI is our biggest existential threat. In the same BBC report, Rollo Carpenter, the creator of Cleverbot, a software designed to chat with humans, stated, "We cannot quite know what will happen if a machine exceeds our own intelligence, so we can't know if we'll be infinitely helped by it or ignored by it and sidelined or conceivably destroyed by it." Fortunately, we have an expert panel to debate the following proposition with us today. The rapidly accelerating advances in artificial intelligence, AI, could pose quite likely a serious existential threat to humanity in the not too distant future. So let me begin by introducing to you, in the order that they're going to present their arguments, our panelists for today, to argue both sides of this proposition, or to argue one side and the other, and one of our panelists, both sides of the proposition. We'll start with Ruth Urner, who's a assistant professor in our Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science here at York University. Her areas of research include machine learning theory, societal aspects to machine learning, fairness in machine learning, and interpretability in machine learning. And she is going to speak against the proposition. Gina Rini holds the Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Moral and Social Cognition, and she's an associate professor in our Department of Philosophy here at York University. She studies how social norms should be negotiated in democratic societies, particularly in response to technological change. And she also writes a regular column called Morals of the Story in the Times Literary Supplement. Matthijs Maas is a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. And his research interests include adaptive global governance approaches to extreme technological risks, with a focus on high stakes or destabilizing uses of AI technology in military contexts and the effects of AI technology on international law, among a number of areas. Allan Weiss is an associate professor in the Department of English and the Department of Humanities at York University. He's a creative writer and scholar who has published in mainstream literary and science fiction and fantasy, short stories, and numerous periodicals and anthologies. And finally, we have Stuart Armstrong, who is a research fellow at the Future of Humanities Institute at the University of Oxford. Stuart has worked with researchers at DeepMind to formalize AI desiderata in general models of AI designers that would include safety methods in their designs, and his collaborations with DeepMind on the topic of interruptibility have been mentioned in over 100 media articles. So we'll begin with Ruth. Each of our presenters will have 15 minutes to make their arguments, again, for or against. At the conclusion of all of our debaters' presentations, we'll have a Q&A. So I would ask everyone to pose their questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have an opportunity for the panelists to respond to your questions at that point. And at the conclusion of the debate, you'll have an opportunity to answer either yay or nay, yes or no, on the proposition itself. So Ruth, please start us off.
Okay, thank you, James. So I'll start with sharing my screen. Actually, so right now screen sharing is disabled. So I don't know who can.
I'll ask Andrew to change that for you. Should work now, Ruth.
Yeah, that looks better. Okay. Yeah, so thank you again. Thank you, James, for inviting me to this debate. So when James first contacted me, suggesting that I take part in this debate and proposing the following thesis: the rapidly accelerating advances in artificial intelligence could pose quite likely a serious existential threat to humankind in the not too distant future. So I immediately said yes, and I thought, okay, this is going to be fun, and clearly I would argue against it. So that seemed very obvious to me, and now I'm in the position here to argue against this proposition, essentially without really having heard what the other side is going to say. So I realized that is of course a little bit of a challenge. So I'll have to anticipate maybe what other people will bring up, and hopefully I can argue that we should all calm down and not be too scared of what AI may bring in the not too distant future. So I'm a little bit afraid that my presentation here or the overall message of my presentation here will feel a little bit like what is happening when I teach machine learning classes here at the university. So I regularly teach an introduction to machine learning course, and my impression, what often happens here is the students come in And they said, oh, we've heard about all the magical things that machine learning can do. Please teach us magic. Right? So they come with high expectation. They've heard about all the successes. And then I come and say, well, machine learning really is just statistics and optimization. Please learn math. And then some people get disappointed. But I think it can also actually serve to calm us down about what we should expect and what we maybe shouldn't expect of machine learning or of AI more generally. So of course the question is, where does this come from? Why? And it's not just students. It's many people that I talk to, even colleagues. I often feel like they kind of expect this technology to do magic. And I was asking myself, where does this come from? Why do we expect such grand things of machine learning, say? So we've had, of course, we've seen many things that machine learning can do, and that maybe many people, didn't expect it, didn't expect machines to be able to do, right? So, for example, routinely now, machine learning technologies are used for image recognition tasks, for face recognition. A few years ago, there was a big success that now machine learning applications can play Go better than any human can play Go. They make movie recommendations. They trade stocks. They can actually generate. They can generate art. They can generate music. They can generate fake videos. They can generate text or speech. So these are all things that maybe we didn't really expect machines to be able to do. That we thought they're maybe special to us humans. And my suspicion is that then what comes out of this surprise that machines suddenly can do things that we didn't expect them to be able to do, is that we are asking, oh my God, what are all the other things that they may also be able to do? The question is, are all these applications that I'm mentioning here, are there reason to believe in an existential threat, right? Do we should we fear that machine learning applications or AI applications are in the not too distant future potentially extinguishing humans, right? And so what I was thinking about is that, so you may have already noticed by now from my accent, I'm German, and I was yesterday. I was being reminded of kind of a a cassette, tells you how old I am, that I had as a child. That had a poem. So it's a poem by Goethe. It's called Der Zauberlehrling, and I wish I could actually cite this poem. So in English, it's called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So the story goes like this. So the sorcerer's apprentice, the student of the magician, is left alone with a magical book and decides, oh, he wants to take a bath, and calls the brooms. So here you see my brooms here, to bring him water, right? So he calls these brooms. The brooms listen to him, listen to his magic, the magic speech, and start bringing him water. And then the student realizes, oh, but I forgot how to turn the brooms off. And then the broom, comes and brings water, and there's more and more water, and the bath fills up, and everything gets flooded, and the student doesn't know how to stop the broom bringing water. Then he takes an axe and breaks it in two, and then there's two brooms bringing water. It gets worse and worse. So my suspicion is that our fear is a little bit what happened in the story, right? So we are afraid that there is this technology that we're using that can do all kind of things that we maybe wouldn't have expected it to be able to do. And we're kind of scared that we created a little bit too much, right? That it's going to get out of control, that we'll at some point not know how to stop it anymore. Right, and we can see that in, if we just look at, headlines, say newspapers, right, about, what is machine learning doing? We see headlines, like this, right? Internet companies prepare to fight the deep fake future, right? So this is a New York Times article. I think this is actually a year old already, warning us of, machine learning now being able to generate videos. Did a person write this headline or a machine, right? Robert wrote this entire article, "Are you scared yet human?" Right? So these are just a few headlines that I found by just doing a quick search of how machine learning is being reported on in the general media, right? And what I want to point out here is that am I scared yet human? I'm actually not too scared, and I'm suspecting that we are just getting a little bit too fascinated with this, with this idea that there's something that we created, and now it's getting out of control, right? So we're kind of enjoying the fantasy, right? So so really, what we're asking here is this an existential threat? So here's a neural network. This is kind of just a small picture of a neural network. Should we fear that this will turn into super intelligence? Should we fear that we're approaching the singularity? That is a term that a few years ago floated around a lot. That we're creating general AI, that the thing is going to become alive, and we are not going to be able to stop it anymore. So I would say we can probably calm down, and so in terms of what I've heard, what I've seen from researchers and developers actually working with this technology, I haven't seen anybody being seriously scared that anything is going to become conscious or alive or behaving in unstoppable ways. So as for this particular fear, I would probably say it's probably more our kind of fascination with the potential, with creating a potential monster, than an actual danger. Of course, I don't want to say that there are no issues or potential problems that coming out of the applications of machine learning or artificial intelligence in general, right? So we can start at looking at scenarios where machine learning technologies actually did behave in ways that we didn't expect, and especially failed in ways that we didn't expect, and that may cause some valid concerns, right? That we should be aware of, right? So, so kind of a I guess a popular, at least in the machine learning community, but now also not that new anymore, example was after deep learning methods became very successful, say in computer vision tasks and image recognition tasks about 10 years ago now. Then in 2013, other researchers found this phenomenon of what's called adversarial examples in machine learning. So what they observed is that even though deep networks are very successful in recognizing objects and images, they say these networks that seem so successful, they can be fooled by very small perturbations to images, right? So what turned out is that maybe in this image here, a network would recognize there's a truck in the image, but if we just flip a few pixels and perturb the image in a way that to a human clearly still looks like there's a truck in this image, suddenly the network doesn't see the truck anymore, right? So there were instances where applications of machine learning failed in, for us, unexpected ways. Right, and that is not just happening with adversarial perturbations, not just happening in computer vision, but of course there are many scenarios where the technology that we're using behaves in a way that maybe the person that decided to use it didn't expect. Right, so adversarial examples, especially in vision applications for images, is one kind of very prominent examples. There are in recent years what's been brought up is issues with algorithmic bias. So it turns out that um, predictors that we train on data that maybe has historical bias. So, for example, there were instances where face recognition task would maybe correctly distinguish between say men and women for white people, but for Black people, it wasn't so successful. So it turned out that the technology inherits the bias from the data that we feed it, and that could then lead to unexpected and of course very undesirable behaviors um, that turns out we actually need to, as designers, as developers, we need to take care of. And of course it can happen that we oversaw some potential issues, and then applications behave in ways that we didn't expect and that we find problematic. So that is definitely, I would say, it's a very serious issue with using statistical methods, using statistical learning methods in real life applications. There's of course huge privacy concerns that came out of um, um, learning technology being used in wider and wider applications, right? So I mean, I think we're very often hear that, right? So we all kind of are reminded of, I don't know, George Orwell in 1984. So we read this novel, I don't know how long ago, and thought, oh my God, how bad would that be if we had cameras and say audio devices in all of our apartments observing us day and night, and now we're all kind of brought our own um, surveillance devices and carrying them around with us all the time, right? So we kind of created our own big brother here. So of course there are concerns, and we need to kind of address these and need to take them seriously and see how we can avoid potential harm that is coming from them. There's of course there are issues with misinformation through recommendation systems. So we've all heard about the stories that Facebook of course recommends say articles based on what a user will likely click on, and that may not that may for example just make a bias that is somebody maybe already has, just make it worse and worse, right? We can get manipulated through these systems. So there are definitely real concerns that we should have and that we should aim to address. But is any of these an existential threat? I'm not so convinced, right? So I think there are issues and we should address them, but the way to address them is not to, draw the ghost and draw the monster coming out of the machine learning application, but to look at what are these applications actually doing, why are they behaving in the way they do, and can we actually do something about it? Can we actually steer them back into the direction that we want them to behave? Right. So we could, of course, also ask what are actual current existential challenges? What should we be worried about right now? Right. And now here I'll just list a few things that I would be most worried about right now. And of course that may, just show my own bias and maybe just show areas about which I don't know that much. So I'm more scared about them. Right. So I would think, we have a huge issue with climate change that we need to address. Is AI contributing to that? Probably it is contributing to that, right? So huge, AI applications may actually use up a lot of energy. So maybe it's contributing to climate change, but it can also help us to better understand climate and weather patterns and maybe address some of these challenges or better understand what is happening, right? We want to protect democracy, right? So here again, that is an issue we could ask ourselves, is AI here actually a contributing factor? Is it the main source of the potential dangers that we're facing? Again, I would say it's probably contributing to some degree, because it's we see it, you know, being applied in more and more applications. But I wouldn't think that that AI is the main driving force. Of course, we should be, you know, scared of some weapons that can cause harm on large scales. And of course, this is also something where AI may contribute. It may be, it's an area where we may need to, you know, take care that we keep being in control. But we've had weapons that, you know, that can destroy humanity for many decades, right? So it's not, again, I would say this is not inherently an AI problem. And lastly, if we think about, you know, why are we all sitting at home since March, right? This was not caused by AI. This is, you know, caused actually by biological threat, by a virus that is forcing us to stay in our homes for many months now, right? So so all of these, I would say, are actual challenges. AI is probably contributing to some degree, but it can also actually help us solve these challenges, right? So here's kind of a more positive headline for AI. What AI can and can't do in the race for a coronavirus vaccine. So it turns out statistical methods are actually very useful, for example, to identify proteins that we need for vaccine development. So one thing that I really want to point out here is, of course, I like this headline better because it's promoting, it's kind of speaking in favor of machine learning applications. But the other difference here is that this headline says, you know, what can it and what can it not do? Whereas I would say some other headlines, they're really just more on the attention seeking and, you know, maybe panic creating side, right? So, so to summarize, so I would say, our problems are often that we want AI to solve our problems without us really needing to understand it. We just want it to do magic for us and find the hidden patterns without us really needing to understand how these methods work. We kind of sometimes enjoy a little bit too much distracting ourselves from potential actual threats by some grandiose fantasy of how AI is going to, you know, take over. And kind of to also blame a little bit the machine learning, the AI development side, I think we often tend to kind of oversell our successes, right? So in the same vein, we have a tendency to tell stories about what we can do without really also pointing out the limitations of what new developments suffer, right? So there's definitely kind of a responsibility in the machine learning or AI community as well, right? So I would say the real challenging is that we should fight our own intellectual laziness, right? We should realize that if we want to use some technology, we need to actually understand it. We cannot hope that anything is going to do magic for us, and maybe not get distracted too easily by fantasies, and be more honest about, you know, what a development can and what it cannot do. So my recommendation would be, so let's stop believing in magic. As a reward, we then don't need to be scared of any monsters coming out suddenly. And maybe as a last recommendation, if anybody does want some distraction, I recommend this comic. This came out, I think, in October this year. So it's a comic featuring several of the probably most prolific machine learning researchers. And I think it gives kind of a good idea of, you know, maybe the discrepancy between what machine learning can do currently and does, and how it's often depicted and described. So that is my last recommendation here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Our next speaker is Professor Regina Rini.
Thank you so much, James, for inviting me to be part of this. Thank you to Ruth for a really engaging setup of the debate, the terms of the debate. We have to fight now because it's a debate. But thank you so much for setting everything up, and thank you to everybody else on the panel. So I'm on the pro side here. I'm arguing that AI, machine learning, does pose an existential threat to humans. But I'm going to be a philosopher and define my terms, and I'm going to do so in a way that is advantageous to my side in the debate. That is, I'm going to suggest that this word existential is sometimes misunderstood in this discussion. So I'm not super worried that AI is going to rise up and kill us all, or enslave us, or drive humans off the planet and turn us all into paper clips. I'm not super worried about the scenarios where death and destruction is the endpoint. I'm going to interpret existential in a more philosophical bent, which is existential has to do with the existence conditions of what we are as human beings. And I'm going to argue that AI can change those conditions, can change us fundamentally in a sense so that we are no longer the entities we once were. If you want to think about the kind of thought I have in mind here is, suppose you've got a statue made out of bronze, and then you melt the statue down and you use the bronze to reform into something else, the exact same amount of bronze, and you make a different statue. Arguably, you can say the statue's been destroyed. Arguably, you can say the statue is now a different statue because it's the same bronze. We could argue about that. This is a thing metaphysicians like to argue about. But I'm going to take the view that once you melt down the statue, whether or not it counts as destroyed, it has been existentially changed in an important sense. And I'm going to argue that AI can do that to us. The second part of the terms of the debate is the word threat. And so what's important here is that existential changes don't have to be bad. So changing one statue into another, maybe the second statue is a really cool statue and the first one was just terrible garbage art. So maybe that's an existentially good thing. So for me to argue my case, I'm going to need to claim that the existential changes that AI is likely to provoke in us are likely to be bad. They're not likely to be existentially good changes in us. Okay, so that's the claim. I'm going to give you one more example to help you get a sense of the kind of argument I'm going to make. I'm not talking about AI yet. I'm giving you another example of where technology has existentially changed us. And this is a change from about 200 years ago. It's the rollout of telecommunications and transport technology. Specifically, I'm thinking here of the telegram and the railroad. The way that most people, starting in Europe, but then around the world, lived in relatively small communities that were relatively isolated, that if you wanted to go and talk to your friend in the next village over, it could take the whole afternoon to get on a horse and go. Many people would never leave their villages. Well, some people would. I don't want to over exaggerate, but a lot of people would just live in one village their entire lives, and their conception of the world was bounded by the place they live in, the area right around it, because they couldn't communicate with or travel to other places. By the mid-19th century, with the rollout of telegram and the railroad, people's conceptions of who they are in the world starts to radically change, because now they can easily get on the train and go down to the big metropolitan city, or they can send a telegram to a friend far away. Over the course of about a century and a half, we got used to a fundamental change in how we conceive of ourselves in the world. My world is not bound just by my local community, by my family and the people around me. I'm now a citizen of the entire planet, of all those places I can travel to and all the people I can talk to. So I'm going to claim, and I have only 15 minutes, so I'm not going to give you a whole historiography of the telegram and the railroad, but I'm going to claim that's an existential change. That was really deeply important. And that might have been a good one. We could argue about whether that counts as a good existential change or not. Some people think not, but I'm going to claim that it's that type of change that I'm interested in, and I'm going to suggest that AI is on track to be a bad one. Okay, those are the terms of what I'm claiming. The basic threat, the thing I'm most worried about, is the way that AI can be a simulacrum of agency. Here's what I mean by that. Agency is the ability to make your own choices, to deliberate for yourself, to decide what to do, and to be held accountable for those choices. Okay, there's a familiar term for philosophers. Agency is the thing we attribute to entities we hold responsible. So I am an agent, you can hold me responsible if I mistreat you, and a thunderstorm is not an agent. We don't morally blame a thunderstorm if it knocks over the fence or something. We might not be happy, but we're not going to talk about it as an agent. And the worry I have with AI is maybe in the far distant future, it will be an agent. Maybe AI could one day be like us and make free choices. But I don't worry about that in the short term. What I'm worried is that it will seem to us like it is an agent. It's a simulacrum. It will behave externally as if it's an agent, enough to trick us into thinking about it that way. whether or not there's actually anything going on inside the machine. Okay, so that's the worry I have, at least in the near to medium term. Basically, the lifetime of me and anyone else listening to this conversation right now. That's the worry, that AI will not actually become like a person, an agential, but that it will have a simulacrum of agency. And the reason why this is a worry is two things. Okay, I'm going to make two claims about why a simulacrum of agency is scary. Okay, the first has to do with how it affects our behavior over time. Okay, how is it for us to interact with an entity that resembles agents like us in many important respects, and that tricks us into feeling like we're engaging with a human type agent, but that is not in fact an agent, or is not in fact a person? And we already have evidence from the internet, which is a terrible place, that interacting with such entities is not so good for us. For example, take Microsoft's chatbot Tay, somewhat infamous in AI circles. Microsoft made a chatbot that you could go and talk with on Twitter, and it would learn from you. It was designed through machine learning processes to learn patterns of communication and talk back to the people it was chatting with. And so, of course, fairly quickly, internet trolls decided to turn Tay into a Nazi by repeatedly talking about Hitler with Tay and convincing Tay to say racist, terrible, fascist things. And Tay, in fact, internalized those and learned to reflect them back. And so pretty quickly, Microsoft shut down Tay, which was sensible. Okay, so the problem here is not that Tay is intrinsically nasty, or obviously Tay did not start off being a Nazi. Tay was basically meant to chat with teenagers and to talk about pop superstars. But because people, given the chance to play with something that sort of resembles a human toddler learning to use language, and given the sense that it's not really a human toddler you can get in trouble for corrupting, they decided it would be fun to make her into a Nazi, right? And not everyone, of course, looks at a toddler and thinks, oh, it'd be fun to it'd be a fun lark, it'd be a humorous troll to turn this into a Nazi. But enough people have that reaction that they went ahead and did it. Okay, so my worry here is that interacting with the simulacrum of agency brings out the worst in some people. Again, these are not people who necessarily themselves want to be Nazis. They're not actually necessarily committed to National Socialism. They don't necessarily think well of Hitler. They decided to be funny, to turn this thing into a Nazi. Okay, so there's something about interacting with this thing that sort of resembles a person, that encourages us to start treating it in ways that we think would be funny to treat a person, but that are not okay to treat a person. It's not okay to take your neighborhood's, babysit for your next door neighbor's toddler and teach her how to shout Nazi slogans. That's not okay. Most of us wouldn't do that, but a bunch of us will do it to a simulacrum of agency. Okay, you might say, so what? Why is this an existential threat? This is just like the internet being stupid and horrible with a new toy it's been given. It's not really that big a deal. Well, the problem is that Tay is not that sophisticated in AI. The problem I'm worried about is as natural language processing bots get better and better over time, and they more and more interact with us in our lives, where they become a regular part of our lives, they'll be more pervasively affecting our behavior in negative ways, okay? So think here of GPT-3, which is this natural language model from OpenAI. It made a big fuss of news stories this summer when it rolled out, because this thing is pretty darn good at producing convincing looking prose. If you seed it with a prompt, it will write a whole news article or a short story that looks pretty human-like. Not perfect, but pretty good, okay? And pretty convincing. And so my worry here is that models like that, natural language models, are increasingly going to be used in day-to-day interaction with people. GPT-3 not yet, but of course the thing's moving very fast. It's only a year after GPT-2 came out, and GPT-3 is much better than GPT-2. And so in the future, in a few years, we're going to have these natural language bots that are very convincing at seeming like people. Why does that matter? Well, there's commercial applications. What are the most obvious ones? Suppose you go on a travel website, in the future when we are allowed to travel again. Suppose you go on a travel website to book a flight, and you're having some trouble interacting with the website, and a little box appears in the corner that says, do you need any help? I am Janet. I am an agent here to help you. Most cases, Janet is not a human being, at least initially. She's a very unsophisticated chatbot at first. The way some companies, I don't know how widespread this is, but the way some do it is that thing is just a pretty simple chatbot, because if you have a very standard question like, I don't remember my password to log into my account, That's a standard answer that a chatbot can efficiently answer for you. But if it's a more complicated question, then Janet will seamlessly hand off from a program to an actual human who is sitting there in some server or some interface bank somewhere, typing on a whole bunch of different conversations at once. And their name is probably not Janet, right? So there's this amalgam of a simple chatbot that does simple initial efficient interactions with behind it an actual person. The problem is that your experience of interacting with this entity is going to be seamless. It's going to feel like it's the same thing throughout. It's a simulacrum of interacting with one agential entity that is a hybrid of a simple program plus a person. As we get GPT-3 and its descendants, commercialized applications of very convincing natural language by machines, as that becomes more available, we will interact more and more frequently with entities like this. And they won't just be text, of course. They will be using things like deepfake technology or simulated fake human faces. So you'll be on a video chat with a thing that initially is just a computer program and not actually that sophisticated. And that might later on in the program, if you start asking tough questions, seamlessly be taken over by a person whose face is being replaced by the faked face of the AI, who will then talk to you through that fake face and voice, and you won't realize you've transitioned from talking to a stupid machine to talking to a real person. Why does that matter? Well, suppose that goes on for a decade. Suppose we start getting used to interacting with these things and we're vaguely aware that the things we interact with as consumers are sort of people and are sort of not, and we get used to them being at our beck and call. That is, you can say whatever you want to this chatbot, just like you can say whatever you want to Tay, because it's not a real person. It's not a real agent. It's just a simulacrum of agency, except sometimes it is a real person because sometimes they step in to take over, but you're not sure. It's this vague boundary where what I'm worried here is that we're going to get trained over the next decade to interact in a dismissive and instrumental way with things that are maybe people and maybe not. And the worry here is that in turn can train us to interact with actual people who are not ambiguous, but are in positions of service, people working in retail, people working in customer service online, basically people who have jobs where they have to deal with the public. We're going to get trained in being used to treating them in dismissive and instrumental ways. Maybe we're not all going to start talking to them like Nazis, but we are going to get used to the idea that we're not as accountable for how we treat these simulacrums of agency or these real agencies in the way we once were. So that's my first worry. My second worry has to do with the thought that we're going to start, this is a more existential worry in the literal sense of that term, and the traditional philosophical sense of that term. We're going to start seeing these entities as being like us and start reasoning backwards to worries about our own place in the world. So to give you a sense of this, imagine the following scenario, a story I've been thinking about as the Great Prediction Event. Suppose there's some big political thing coming up. Maybe it's the next US presidential election. Everybody's talking about it, et cetera. It's 2024, right? Suppose some clever natural language processing company decides to do the following. They take all of our collective tweets and they predict what each of us is going to say about the election the next morning, okay? So they use machine learning to crunch everything you've ever tweeted in the past, you personally, each of us individually, and to predict exactly what we're gonna say the morning after the election result. And they've got one for if the Democrat wins and one if the Republican wins, okay? And they store those in some kind of registered archive, those predictions, so that they can prove they made those predictions, but they don't release them until like 2 days after the election. Suppose they get it right for a lot of us, many of us. Suppose they get it right for you. Suppose they predict before the election what you will tweet about the result very closely. Suppose the language is actually like, 80% match what you actually wrote. What are you going to think about that? It starts to look like we people who see ourselves as genuine agents, as having free will, as making these deeply significant, meaningful choices. If we're that predictable, that we can be modeled by an AI that well, what effect is that going to have on how you think about the significance of your own choices going forward, the language you choose to use? Now, I could talk to you about this forever. I only have about a minute left in my time. So what I'm going to do instead is suggest that this problem's been at the core of these debates about the nature of AI since the beginning. If you go back to 1960, there's a debate in the journal Science between Norbert Wiener, one of the first cyberneticists, and Arthur Samuel, who was one of the first AI programmers, designed this famous chess playing program. And Urner argues that AI could go on, computers could go on to do all kinds of clever things. Whereas Samuel takes the view that this isn't actually possible. He says, I'm just going to read a short quote of you. He says, there is and there logically must always remain a complete hiatus between any ultimate extension and elaboration in this process of carrying out man's wishes and the development within the machine of a will of its own. In other words, the machines can only do what we tell them to do. They're never going to do anything new on their own, anything novel on their own. He continues, to believe otherwise is either to believe in magic or to believe that the existence of man's will is an illusion and that man's actions are as mechanical as the machines. Perhaps Wiener's article and my rebuttal have both been mechanistically determined, but this I refuse to believe. Right? That's the argument. That's the end of the argument right there. It can't be that AI is going to be able to make choices on its own, because if that could happen, that would show that choices are just mechanical, which would show that we, choice-making agents, are also mechanical. And this I refuse to believe, says Samuel. And that's the showstopper of the argument. That is my fundamental worry about the existential risk of AI, is that once these simulacrums of agency get sophisticated enough that they can start predicting us and acting like us in all respects, that we can't reliably tell the difference between us and them, then it's going to rebound to us and how we conceive of ourselves existentially. And that's going to be incredibly difficult to deal with. That's why AI is an existential threat.
Thank you so much, Gina. Our next debater is Matthijs Maas.
Right, thanks, James. And I'd like to thank the previous speakers, Ruth and Regina, for these points and for setting me up for a few tough acts to follow, but I'll certainly try. So yeah, so we've seen a lot of the focus over the last few years and the sort of the promise and risks of AI, and that has a lot of excitement, but also concern. And so I'm in the strange situation that I'm at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, but I find myself in a position where I'm for the debate, I'll be arguing against the idea that AI will, within the not too distant future, pose a serious existential risk to humankind. Now, I want to be clear here, sort of to also, because just like Regina, I want to put all of the definitions in my favor, but I'm not arguing certain types of things. So I'm not arguing that AI hasn't seen impressive advances. I'm not arguing that, for the sake of this argument, I'm not arguing that advanced or highly capable AI systems are sort of physically impossible or categorically impossible. Maybe most importantly, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't worry about AI and go back to sleep, or we shouldn't pay so much public attention to this. So while I'm very excited about the potential of AI, I also fully believe that even simple machine learning technologies today, if rolled out, certain capabilities or applications are more than sufficient to create many challenges in society, which in many cases will count as transformative when set against any reasonable historical standards. And even to sort of get that out of the way, in a very tragically mundane sense, today's algorithms, or even 20 years ago, the computers were more than sufficient to be involved in global catastrophes of the extinction kind. The Soviet Union, during the late Cold War, was running a quasi-automated nuclear launch control system. So Dr. Strangelove was not as much of a satire as it sort of seemed it was. The US has had informal debates over automating parts of their nuclear command and control. Right, if something goes wrong there, then you have a extinction type, or like at least a global disaster indirectly precipitated by AI. But so, but what we're arguing in this context about is the debates around sort of the direct threats from advanced human-like or superhuman-like AI, whether or not we're talking about consciousness, which is a bit of a sort of peripheral debate that often gets sort of mixed into it, even though it's very confusing. So for reasons that I'll put forward, I'll argue that even if we do grant some of the assumptions of people worried about advanced AI, it's still not necessarily it's still not plausible that AI will pose an existential threat to humankind. Specifically, I see three arguments against this scenario. In the first place, advanced AI of this level plausibly is not possible, accessible to us, or at all near. Secondly, even if it is achieved, advanced AI wouldn't intrinsically create a serious existential threat to us. And thirdly, even if the types of AI we create, these sort of advanced types of AI, were to create an existential threat to us, we could likely be adequately manage, detect, or contain this in time. So to start with the first argument, advanced AI of this level is not plausible or accessible or near. So from an outside view, it's important to remember that we have in the past sort of jumped the gun on anticipating the arrival of a range of technologies while underappreciating the limits. In the 1960s, there was such anticipation of the arrival of weather control technology that legal scholars began drafting an international treaty to regulate it. Fusion power is proverbially always 20 years away. And of course, AI itself has had several sort of periods of excessive anticipation. So it can be asked also, while progress in AI in recent years has been impressive and certainly useful, are we actually seeing sort of rapidly accelerating advances? So for one, as Ruth already sort of pointed out, today's algorithms are still quite limited in important ways in terms of brittleness, their ability to do causal reasoning, their susceptibility to sort of these spoofing inputs. So you can hack them by showing them certain types of pictures. And so while their performance is increasing and some of these sort of growing pains may disappear, it's unclear if their performance will scale indefinitely using the current set of approaches. And it's quite sort of prima facie unlikely. And also underlying this, in terms of sort of the software side of this, in recent years, a number of scholars have pointed to what are seen as sort of like signs of replication problems or phantom progress in certain subfields of AI. And more fundamentally, there may be limits to hardware, which has been the big driver of a lot of advances. So between 2012 and 2018, the amount of computing power used by top AI training systems increased by over 300,000 times, which is far faster than Moore's law can keep up. And we're going to run out of this within the sort of the next 6 years. I've had a friend used to joke that, current increases in AI computing trends are impossible to sustain after the year 2026, because then the oceans will boil. So underlying this, it's unclear if sort of human level AI is achievable with these sort of the tools that we have. Of course, human intelligence is an existence proof that something that is generally intelligent like us is possible. But if fundamental breakthroughs are needed to recreate this in sort of not through long process of evolution, but sort of in silicon from a top-down design, it's unclear whether we are capable of those insights and whether those would come soon. And so Andrew Ng has described worrying about AI's existential threats as worrying about overpopulation on Mars, but that may not even be necessary. Like, we know in principle how to land on planets. And so algorithms theorist Thora Hasfeld has instead compared this to worrying about overpopulation on the sun. We don't know even how to build structures on the sun. So, and finally, the question of, okay, is this type of AI near? There's a lot of uncertainty about this. So funnily enough, public opinion surveys in the US suggest that the majority of the US public thinks we'll have human level AI sometime in the next 10 years, which is like, okay, if you believe that, why aren't you changing the way you live your life? But expert surveys of AI researchers have longer timelines and generally expect what they call high-level machine intelligence within the next 5 to 6 decades. But it's unclear if surveys like that are actually methodologically relevant. It may just be a sort of category error in asking today's machine learning researchers to confidently predict the arrival of AGI. That's a very different technology. It's a bit like asking 18th century hot air balloon designers about predicting the moon landing. Maybe they know a lot about aerodynamics, but they don't have the right insights yet, or their field doesn't have the right insights yet to make meaningful predictions like that. So my second argument is that even if AGI like that is achieved, it wouldn't intrinsically pose an existential threat to us. Now, it's important to sort of have a general note on the debate in this space is that many critiques of existential risk concerns are often sort of misconstrued or conflate these concerns with science fiction, which is not really sort of adequate. So people often still refer to sort of Kurzweil and singularity, and that's basically, that has been several waves of scholarship in this area ago. So that doesn't have that much effect. And also Elon Musk is not really helping the debate in this, or the quality of discourse in this area. So the point is, the arguments shouldn't be dismissed out of hand, but they should be critically examined. And there are a number of sort of conceptual or methodological challenges around this. And I'm drawing a lot on the arguments by Benjamin Garfinkel. In part, a lot of these arguments about AI risks rely on sort of fuzzy or abstract concepts like optimization power or general intelligence. And a lot of them appeal to sort of thought experiments. And while those things could play a role in reasoning around this, it's unclear sort of how strong we should count this as a source of evidence. And there are basically three core premises to the existential risks from AI argument. One is the discontinuity premise, the idea that we'll have an intelligence explosion in a single very powerful AI system. Secondly, the idea that it's very hard to tell that AI system what we want in a way that doesn't lead to really bad outcomes. And thirdly, the idea that all types of advanced AI that we ever create would be risky in this way. And all three of these premises can be challenged. So in the intelligence explosion argument, while historically there have been technological discontinuities, these are relatively rare, and usually technological progress, especially in automation, has been quite continuous, even if it's a bit hard to predict. And also within the assumption of self-improvement in an AI system, it doesn't seem necessary to assume that that then leads to a like, oh, it's sort of human and then it'll just be superhuman. There may be very likely be diminishing returns and bottlenecks amongst many cognitive dimensions. An AI system wouldn't be able to sort of reason all of the possible improvements it could make. For some of these things, or to create a theory of science, you need to be able to do experiments with the physical world. So an AI system will be bottlenecked by that. And also, funnily enough, an AI system, when it's sort of, if we had an AI system and it's thinking about making itself more intelligent, it faces the same problem that we face when thinking about switching on an advanced AI system, which is that if we are unsure about whether it will share our values, this AI system will have to be unsure about whether its improved version will still share the values entirely. Now, moreover, there's this assumption that value alignment of the AI is hard because basically, if you have a very intelligent system, like even if it's smart, it doesn't mean that it's wise. This is called the orthogonality thesis. And that assumption seems a bit true, as you can sort of see in the existence of humans, like human sociopaths, although there is some contestation. But the underlying thing is that a lot of these arguments assume that the process of creating advanced AI systems is completely decoupled from the process of aligning its sort of values or goals with human values. So it's the idea that we could completely create advanced AI on the capability research while having no progress on the alignment research, and then it would be really dangerous. But that doesn't seem true in the sense that in a lot of AI in development and engineering processes, to make progress on capabilities or having the AI do certain things, we have to make progress on value alignment to sort of give feedback to the system or the machine learning system. Like what we see in reinforcement learning, is this system doing what we want? And more generally, while human values are hard to specify, even in contemporary machine learning, we can train a lot of systems to engage in behavior that's quite nuanced. Now, then the third argument or premise in this debate is the assumption that every type, like if we create advanced AI, it necessarily is risky in these ways. But firstly, it seems that the way that AI research has progressed to date, it seems that it would mostly focus on specialized systems, and it sort of wouldn't naturally follow that someone would set out to create a comprehensive agent like AGI. Like military strategists don't care about their cyber warfare AI composing poetry. They care about it being useful in cyber warfare and vice versa. But generally also, it's a funny way of thinking about this, because if you generalize the way of reasoning that, oh, if it's possible to create a technology in a dangerous way, we will create it, that doesn't really work for other technologies. So like, it's possible to create a plane that isn't safe to fly. And indeed, there are more permutations or ways to create a plane in ways that it would crash or that would have a window open. But of course, we don't randomly grab in a bag of technologies. We guide the process of technological development in ways that, we pick the types of planes that are safe, and we have feedback in the development process. Now, thirdly, and I'll try to keep this short because I'm running out of time, even if we grant if we surrender the other two arguments I made, and we say, okay, we will create advanced AI and there will be an intrinsic existential threat, it's plausible that we can, it's not guaranteed, but it's plausible that we can adequately detect, contain, or address this in time. So as I argued, most likely there will be no or few sudden jumps or discontinuities in AI development. And so if we assume further progress and there are no major barriers, even then we will have these technologies rolled out across society. And so there will be many earlier and smaller failures. So we won't necessarily be caught unaware, and AI researchers will have feedback and instances to learn from. And we will be able to react. So AI existential risks, there are no guarantees whenever we're talking about smarter than human, but there are compelling reasons that we are to suspect we're far from helpless, because we can use intermediate term AI systems to help monitor and contain the behavior of even more advanced systems. We can also, it's important to remember that we can contain these systems because extreme intelligence does not entail omnipotence. Certain chess positions just cannot be solved no matter how intelligent you are. Certain types of cryptography may not be able to be broken. And as a general case, we already have ways of chaining the behavior of more intelligent agents through simpler protocols, as seen in how we chain the behavior of human agents through smart contracts and blockchain. And finally, Jan LeCun has argued that even if someone builds a dangerous and generally intelligent AI, it's plausible, if not certain, that we could build a specialized AI to counter and destroy it. And that if they have the same amount of resources, a specialized AI will be able to destroy a more general system in the same way that a tiger or a shark can kill a human of superior intelligence. And so on these grounds, I make the case that even assuming some of the premises of, we could even see further AI development in the future, we shouldn't necessarily expect existential threats from AI within the near or even midterm future. And I would like to also briefly then, having made that point, I like to briefly respond to Regina's some of the claims she made. I like the framing and understanding, which is very creative and really has made me argue against something very different than what she proposed for. I do think there's a degree to which I think there's, coming from a socio-technical perspective, we often find that many risks that seem possible from a philosophical argument and maybe demonstrated in edge cases don't necessarily take widespread take up in society. And so there's been previous predictions, like when the internet came on the scene, you had the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace and people arguing this is going to make states obsolete. There's no way that they can contain it. And their symbolic disruption has been less pronounced than it was anticipated. And so it's important to remember that people are quite different. We should avoid the typical mind fallacy. She may be worried about what the the prediction of tweets would do to our sense of free will. I may be worried even about that, but I can guarantee you that large portions of the world population never had a model of their own free will that assumed that AI or advertisement agencies are already predicting things about people. It doesn't seem qualitatively different. And finally, there seems in many of these cases, it seems like there's a self-correcting element of this. So how many of you still trust that the email you get in your spam filter is really from a foreign prince promising you money? That may have worked for some time for some people, but similarly, we may see a trend where things like GPT-3 may lead people to simply distrust online text, which creates its own set of societal problems. But these are not in any meaningful sense existential, even in the broader symbolical or the looser symbolical term. And I also I would argue that Regina's account of what the effects of AI in the world would be certainly bad. I don't want to live in that world, or I'm worried about that world, but it seems a bit of an inflation of the term to argue that this is on par with existential risk of the type of human extinction, either on a moral level or a historical level. And so on the basis of these arguments, I would argue that advanced AI is likely not possible. Even if it is achieved, it's not intrinsically an existential risk. And if it is an existential risk, there are many ways that we can counter it. We won't be helpless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthijs. Our next speaker is Professor Allan Weiss. Allan, I think you're muted.
Okay, how's that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I jumped right to the share screen. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very interesting debate. I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who writes, researches, and teaches science fiction and has a passing acquaintance with the science and technology underlying it. The rest of you will have a better sense than I do of how close we are to be taken over by the machines. In my field, we talk about something we call the Frankenstein syndrome. I think you can figure out what that means. It's the idea that we'll create something that will destroy us. The idea actually has its roots far earlier than Mary Shelley's seminal 1818 novel. It finds its sources in the idea of hubris, the source of the downfall of the classic tragic hero. And even beyond that, the notion of forbidden knowledge is expressed so clearly in the Garden of Eden myth. Basically, the message is don't pursue knowledge that will make you a god, because human beings, fallible and short-sighted and unwise as we are, make terrible gods. In the histories of science fiction, we find numerous, and of science itself, we find numerous examples of technological achievements that came back to bite us. Frankenstein's creature is among the most famous. In fact, the novel's a little ambiguous about whether Shelley really condemns Victor for his presumption or courage in assuming God's prerogative in creating a living being, or whether his real sin is taking no responsibility for his creation. Either way, it's clear that you shouldn't play God if you don't have what it takes. The creature only kills a few people, Victor's family and friends, but it wouldn't take long for science fiction to show the syndrome spreading much farther over the globe. By the 20th century, other so-called mad scientists in science fiction were creating germs capable of slaughtering thousands and even millions. Even before the First World War, H.G. Wells speculated on the development of nuclear bombs in his novel, The World Set Free. Future wars in science fiction throughout the first half of the 20th century were fought with advanced biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons, with the latter dominating apocalyptic visions after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bomb became the ultimate example, in fact, of the Frankenstein syndrome. Now, it wouldn't just be a few loved ones who perished at the hands of our own creation, but the entire human race. Individual scientists and corporations in science fiction have continued to produce artificial life forms of various sorts, beings we would consider the children of Frankenstein's monster. Some are biological, like the human-animal hybrids of Dr. Moreau, and the robots, the original robots of Carol Chapek's RUR, all the way up to the replicants. And here's The World Set Free with an image of the atomic bomb. The Island Dr. Moreau, RUR, and the replicants in Blade Runner, and Peter Watts's posthumans in his Rifters novels of the 21st century. It's noteworthy, by the way, that Watts has been interested in cognitive science and what that tells us about our ability to choose whether we have free will or whether there are chemicals and other things in our brains that are determining our choices for us. Some of the things that Regina was talking about earlier come into play here, I think, and also some of the things that others have said. Others are mechanical. We have the Isaac Asimovs and others, robots and androids, and the Borg of Star Trek. But I'm going to anticipate what I'll be saying later, but what these beings do is that they raise really important questions having to do with rights. The issue is, do these beings have rights? Are they entitled to human rights? These beings blur the lines between human and non-human to the point of causing us to be utterly uncertain where the biological ends and the electronic begins. Meanwhile, science fiction authors have devised bigger and better artificial brains that would supposedly serve us, but that instead become our masters. One of my favorite examples is The Machine with a capital M. In E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, the first portrayal of the internet in science fiction, as far as I'm aware. Direct experience is frowned upon in favor of communication via screens and mediated by the capital M machines. Human beings have come to worship the device that provides them with food, shelter, clothing, entertainment, and everything else, to the point of treating the machine's instruction and repair manual as a Bible. What I find really funny, especially this year, is that students were decrying this mechanization of human contact via Zoom in our science fiction course. We are living out life in the machine, and people not completely aware of the irony of their complaints about this kind of existence expressed entirely through the machine. AIs in science fiction include Mike and Robert A. Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, Shalmaneser in John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar, and of course Hal in 2001: A Space Odyssey, not to mention Colossus in the novels by D.F. Jones. When I teach Frankenstein, I always ask one key discussion question: is the creature human? I force my students to confront their assumptions, requiring them to come up with definitions of human and see whether that definition can accommodate a being created in a lab. Science fiction has been described as a form of inoculation against future shock. It forces us to deal with moral and ethical questions before we face them in real life. Frankenstein requires us to figure out, before we can actually create such a being, whether he, she, it is human. Generally speaking, we're not so proactive. We are reactive instead, coming up with treaties or laws to deal with technological issues after we've already created the dangers. We've tried to push the genies of nuclear weapons and climate change back into their respective bottles. I can think of only one instance where we thought ahead, outlawing human cloning before we could actually clone humans. Needless to say, in science fiction, advanced forms of technology, including and especially artificial brains, generally escape our control. Isaac Asimov tried to assuage our fears by creating the 3 laws of robotics, which forbid robots from harming human beings. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such laws would conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Asimov believed that we could program advanced machines to keep them from doing what they and golems and geoengineered or bioengineered viruses and zombies, and you name it, tend to do in science fiction and fantasy: run amok. I think it says something that other science fiction authors ignored Asimov's optimistic speculations and continued to portray the powerful things we invent as Frankenstein's monsters, ready to turn on us at a moment's notice. Science fiction depicts our hopes and fears in concrete form. And when it comes to our fears, a major one is that we're becoming more and more capable of producing world-ending or human enslaving forms of technology. Now, in all of these sources of apocalyptic visions, I think there is one qualitative difference between nukes, clones, robots, androids, engineered viruses, etc. on one hand, and AIs on the other. And this goes back to what Gina was saying earlier. It has to do with agency. Consider a nuclear bomb. We choose to make the bomb. We choose to deploy it. We choose to use it or not use it. And so if we destroy ourselves in a giant flash of life, it's entirely up to us. The fault would be our own. And at any point, we can smarten up and turn back. We construct and thereby control, however stupidly or short-sightedly, the bombs, clones, viruses, and androids we inflict on our world. Unless, of course, they can learn or think how, they can or learn how to think for themselves. With AI, our agency ends with the creation of the being. The whole point of an AI, as opposed to a computer, is that it is no longer a slave to the program we create for it. Asimov was right to try to insert at the positronic robot's core a set of inviolable moral principles more secure and unassailable than our own. Yet even his robots sometimes lose their minds, so to speak. An AI has, and would have, its own mind. A sentient machine learns and thinks for itself. By its very nature, it is more than a mere product of our technological efforts. By definition, it is not us. It is autonomous. Of course, we could declare that any artificial mind would nevertheless have to be subject to our rules and regulations. We could designate AIs as second-class citizens, subordinate to us, true humans, and limit their autonomy. We certainly have a long history of deciding which human beings, biologically ourselves, have rights and which don't. We feel sorry for having done so, but the precedents are there. Why could we not simply say, you're like us, but you're not us, and set boundaries on what these beings could and could not do? At that point, I would just ask you the question I ask my students. If an AI has independent thoughts and, yes, feelings, is it human? Can you draw neat and clear lines between what is and isn't human by some definition or other? Especially given how many creatures among us challenge our species' boundaries and hierarchies. We used to find self-definition and self-aggrandizement so easy. Well, only humans think and plan, while animals are just instinct-driven biological machines. No, sorry, Descartes. Only humans have language. Hardly. Only humans have emotions. Have you never owned a pet? Only humans use tools. Not even close. We used to love finding ways to distinguish ourselves from the non and subhumans. But science, which is ironically a very human invention, has punctured every self-serving, anthropocentric myth we've created. Our hubris seldom survives direct confrontation with reality. Would AIs have rights then? Can we deprive them of human or even animal rights if we cannot be absolutely certain what distinguishes us from them? And if we grant them rights much like or identical to our own, and even autonomy, what will our relationship be with them? Can we be sure we'll coexist? Frankenstein's creature began life with an adult body, but a blank slate of a mind. He was fully a product of his environment through much of his early days. He lacked parental guidance and benefited from a very romantic-inspired fundamental innocence that always led him to expect the best from people. Experience taught him otherwise. His appearance provoked hatred and even violence from those he encountered. It would be easy to blame Victor Frankenstein for the evil turn the creature takes, because it is true, Victor abandoned him and left him to fend for himself without parental love or support. The creature himself blames Victor. for what happens to him and his declaration of war against the human race. And yet in a telling line, he makes it clear that he chooses what would later become known as the dark side. I, like the archfiend, bore a hell within me, and finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. And then he goes on later, there was none among the myriads of men that existed who would pity or assist me. And should I feel kindness toward my enemy? No. From that moment, I declared everlasting war against the species, and more than all, against him who had formed me and set me forth in this insupportable misery. You see, like so many of us humans, the creature knows the difference between good and evil because he has, like Adam, lost his innocence and gained knowledge of the existence of good and evil. Like so many of us, he would love to blame others, like his parent, for his selecting the path of evil. The problem for him is that if he knows the difference, the choice is his. The responsibility is his. He can't blame Victor if he chooses Satan as his role model. And when he murders, tortures, frames others for his crimes, and destroys Victor mentally and physically, it is because he is more human than he is willing to admit. It is because he is an autonomous moral being. If we create true AIs, we will be creating autonomous moral beings, creatures capable of making their own moral, ethical, and other choices. We will no longer have the ability, and we wouldn't even have the right to limit those choices. AIs will not be advanced tools that we will be able to wield for good or ill, but beings equal to and like ourselves. And if that is the case, if they are anything like ourselves, I believe we have good reason to fear what they might do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allan. And our final speaker is Stuart Armstrong.
Okay, let me share the screen. Wait, order of operations. Right. Can people see and hear?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So yes, thanks for inviting me in this debate. It's proved very interesting so far, and I hope to keep that up. And when I saw the title, was AI an existential threat? I knew what the answer was. The answer was definitely that my slides won't advance. Sorry, the answer was definitely yes. It is definitely an existential threat. Also, no, it's possibly not an existential threat, and probably something or other. So let me explain why I'm giving such a firm answer to this important question. The first thing is that, to be frank, humans suck at predicting AI. This is the Dartmouth conference from 1956 that basically invented the field. And they were kind of predicting that we'd have AI over the course of a summer. Now, I've done what practically no one nowadays has done, and I've looked at their actual proposal, and it's good. It's good, it's solid. They have lines of research. It's very impressive. They know what to need to do and what will be problems, and it's written by some of the best minds of the world at the time, and some of the best minds with the most practical experience in making machines do what they wanted them to do. And it is completely and utterly failed. 9 years later, in an otherwise excellent book on paper on AI, Dreyfus kind of suggested that we'd reached the limit of what AIs or computers could ever do. These are sort of the bookends of the wrong predictions. But there's been a lot of predictions made by lots of people over time. This is roughly when people would predict we'd have something AI-like. The term AI is very slippery, but this is the best that we could do. Here's Turing's original prediction, predicting something of that capability by the year 2000. Here is the AI winter, where everyone was pretending not to do AI anymore. And there's a little bit of accumulation around 2030, but generally speaking, it's all over the place. And I've delved into them. The predictions are worse than you would think. They are often based on just vague intuitions that something would be reasonable or something would be unreasonable. And the only strong pattern that I was able to find is that people tended to predict that within 15 to 25 years after the moment they came the prediction is the most likely date. We actually have theoretical reasons to expect that these predictions are bad, not just in practice. Because we've done some analysis of when experts are good and when they're poor. It tends to be a feature of the task that they're doing. We tend to get good performance on things that have the features on the left and poor performance on things that have features on the right, sort of independently of the profession or the level of expertise. For example, anesthesiologists are true experts. Doctors who interpret mammograms, not so much, even though they're comparable education and quality. The most important are expert disagreements, feedback above everything else, and the decomposition of the problem. And for predicting strong AI, we're kind of stuck in this area. So we would expect poor performance, and we've seen poor performance. To belabor the point a little bit, this is the XKCD's cartoon about fields arranged by purity, and it's kind of similar to the quality, to the predictability of the field. Mathematicians' predictions are basically almost perfect. Predictions of the others get worse and worse. As you go down, it's because mathematicians have deductive logic, physicists have hard versions of the scientific method, and then you go down to the poor historians who really just have past examples. And most predictions about the future are even worse than that because they only have expert opinion and don't even have good past examples to draw upon. But not knowing much or not being very good does not make the experts more modest or tentative about their predictions, which it should. Just to pick on economics for the moment, here is Paul Krugman saying that Chicago economists are in a dark age, and John Cochrane, a Chicago School of Economics, responding in a similar generous spirit. This is a field, by the way, where the GDP adjustments tend to go up by +1 or 0.7 points. What that means is those numbers you get, the economy grew by 0.5% this quarter, that number is generally adjusted later on. It wasn't the true number, it goes up and down by this. This is often enough to tip a recession into an increase or the opposite. Now, in AI predictions, there tends to be, when predicting that AI is safe, these tend to be predictions that look at it as another technology, like in this technology tree from civilization. AI is just one technology. It's towards the end, but it's like space colonization or nanotech. The predictions that show AI to be potentially dangerous or an existential threat focus it as a unique technology, as they look into the details of it. Some of you might know this as the outside view versus the inside view. Do you put it in a general category, or do you zoom in on the specifics? So let's have some look at the outside view as to why AI might be safe. The first is that humans are terrible at predicting the impacts of revolutionary technologies, or whether a technology or a development is going to be revolutionary. There was Khrushchev's "we will bury you" because of the manifest superiority of the Soviet Union's planned economy. Didn't quite turn out that way. There was, in terms of weapons, Stanley Baldwin was predicting that the bomber would always get through. This is pre-Second World War. Fortunately, the British government didn't listen too much to this prediction. So it's worth pointing that out, because the bombers all get through is basically an apocalyptic prediction that once the bomber is developed, nothing should be done except maybe building more bombers. The entire world will be transformed. And the Second World War was bad, but it was not completely different or completely transformative from the wars that had happened before. I'm bouncing around in history. There's lots and lots of examples. They're mainly illustrative. This is Queen Elizabeth I, refusing the patent on a very dangerous technological innovation. Someone had put a automated knitting machine of some form, and she predicted all the unemployment and the ruins that would come from this. So even before the Luddites, people were worried about these kind of developments. There's been technological peace theory, where people were saying that increase in technology will lead inevitably to human peace. Somewhat debatable, though it may be more accurate nowadays than it was before. And finally, let's just take a personal example, the smartphone. If you imagine going back to yourself in the 1990s and telling yourself all the things that a smartphone could do, how would you imagine that society is transformed? And your predictions will probably be wrong. You'll be focusing on, we have all the world's knowledge at our fingertips kind of idea, rather than the social implications, which have turned out to be much more important than we thought. So this is the main reason why predictions of AI should be taken with a grain of salt. It's because we have a terrible track record. And some of the arguments for existential risk from AI are very similar to the arguments that were given for various revolutionary implications. We just cannot imagine how something can be revolutionary but then integrated into society in a way that goes on. The other thing is that this has been hinted on it, there are people, including me, that are trying to intervene to stop dangerous AI. The Millennium Bug was not, it wasn't overblown, it was dealt with. People saw it, people dealt with it, and then very little happened because people intervened. There was an old song by Tom Lehrer, Who's Next, on nuclear proliferation, where he imagines that every nation was getting their own nuclear bomb and ending with the memorable line, and we'll all stay serene and calm when Alabama gets the bomb. But it didn't happen. Proliferation, we had some proliferation, but we have 7 odds nuclear powers in the world today. And we have a lot less nuclear weapons than we had in the 80s. So human efforts do happen. And there's another thing that derails predictions, is that there tends to be a self-limiting aspect to most risks. To pick on a topical one at the moment, how diseases spread. Initially, there's a huge moment of vulnerability, but because it hits the most vulnerable, the easiest to spread, and then afterwards, it's left with the most difficult targets there. So there are strong diminishing returns to a technology or any sort of risk. And finally, predictions that reek of utopian or apocalypticism tend to have a pretty poor track record, and tend to trigger sort of really theological or bad sorts of thought processes in the people that do it. Now, this doesn't mean don't dismiss all these arguments, and definitely don't try and figure out whether we'll have AI in 50 years by thinking of the psychology of human predictors. But just a warning that apocalyptic and utopian predictions have an even worse track record than most others. And AI, the super powered AI, is both. It's either the apocalypse or the utopia. So this is a sort of outside view as to why we probably should not worry about AI, because it is similar to other things, safer technologies. Now let's have a look at the inside view. Why should we worry about AI? Well, let's have a look at the power of intelligence. This is a chimp brain, and that is a human brain. The chimps have a population of around 200,000 and use basic wooden tools. Humans, well, we have heavy industry, nuclear weapons, and we've spread across the entirety of the planet. Chimps basically continue to survive at our sufferance. We protect them or we kill them, and the chimps' fate is entirely in our hands. And since we've expanded our abilities with computers, we've done things like getting to the moon, hydrogen bombs, and extreme economic growth. So these are the returns on intelligence. And it's fair to ask what would happen if we move to the next step on this intelligence scale. Now, what could we do with human intelligence? Because the main thing, what I'm defining as an AI for the purpose of this, is human skills in digital form. So if we had human level skills, we could take the AI equivalent of Einstein, Edison, J.K. Rowling, Oprah, Thatcher, Confucius, Goebbels, Bernie Madoff, and Steve Jobs. These are all people who are cognitively brilliant in their area of expertise. Give them huge amounts of data, run them on thousands and thousands of times of human speed, and you have, so that they have, say, 2 weeks to think before every response that they give. And you have an entity that is more powerful than anything we've really imagined in the world today, one that might find the internet and the human race as a useful tool for achieving its goal. Now, I'll skip over the other slides to come, but the basic point is that it's not only one of these entities, but this entity can be copied. We have this equivalent, this superhuman entity, much better than any human that exists, and we can make millions of copies of it. And we can use those millions of copies to create more infrastructure, which can create billions on which to run. So this is, from the inside view, the potential power of an artificial intelligence. And there are other arguments about the power and also the danger of it, which I won't go into, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of why you might think, despite the arguments I said at the beginning, there might still be extreme danger from AI, because this time it might really be different. AI really could be different from preceding technologies. Now, probability and arguments. This is just 100 to 0, 99.9, etc. Almost. At one end, you have 2 + 2 is 4. Energy is conserved. That's floating almost at 100%. You won't win the lottery. That is floating in the 99.9s. Perpetual motion machines are down at the other end, and the fact that you will win the lottery is at the other end. Now, what is true is that if you're uncertain about something, you shouldn't react like the economists reacted. You should instead be uncertain. You can't say, well, I don't know about this, or this is maybe this or maybe that, and immediately conclude, therefore, we will definitely have a killer AI, or therefore AI cannot happen, or whatever you want to go for. True uncertainty pushes you towards the middle. And there are various types of uncertainty. The first one is ones where you have no evidence. The gender of the first leader of Mars. We really don't have a clue. Second one is weak evidence. Gender of the US president in 2037. It's the US president in 2037 already exists, and it's probably in politics in a semi-important role at the moment. You might be able to do an estimate of this, but you really don't have much to go on. And we have balanced evidence, like the gender of the next US president after Biden. We have an unusually high probability of it being a woman this time around because of his vice presidential choice. But this is balanced evidence. And what we have for AI is basically no evidence or weak evidence. And these have to push towards the middle. You can't justify the kind of things about winning lottery or not winning lottery, or even just short-term predictions with where AI is concerned. I personally put it around here, which is, it depends on exactly how the question is phrased, but it varies between 1/3 and 5%, depending on how you phrase it. So existential risk, less likely than not. But still, would you get on a plane if you were told that, don't worry, there's only a 10% chance that it'll crash while you're flying? And here, with the potential powers that AI could have, we're talking about crashing the world. So this is, even when I go for my 5% low estimate, this is what makes it worth my while to do research in this area and try and make it safe. And I will just conclude by saying the AI risk thesis could be, say, that AI is effective at unbounded, unfriendly goals. And we are coming up with ways of fighting every single parts of this sentence. I have a bunch of papers addressing lots of different ways. So I'm trying to block it out at every single level. And here is the conclusion. And I'm sorry that I went over time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Stuart. It's now our audience's opportunity to pose questions to our debaters. So if you have a question that you would like to raise, could you please put it in the Q&A? And then we'll pose your question to our debaters. And as we're waiting for our questions to come in, I know, Matthijs, you started off by commenting on Gina's arguments. Do you want to respond to anyone else in terms of the arguments that they've presented?
Well, so what I liked about sort of Stuart's argument and the way he finished off is the emphasis on essentially a degree of the uncertainty around this, and a degree of, I think, a debate format perhaps focuses on very concrete positions, but I think a lot of these questions, the intellectually honest position is there is uncertainty, and there's emphasis on reducing that uncertainty where and when we can. But I think, yeah, I think that's better than sort of better than go home and be completely reassured, or go home and be completely terrified. It's more of a sense of how do we navigate or negotiate around these topics in that way.
Be terrified in a reassuring way.
Gina, I think you were ready to respond there, and I cut you off. Apologies for that.
No, that's all right. I want to respond to Matthijs and what he said in response to me a little while ago. So he suggested that I might be engaging in a bit of conceptual inflation to talk about the things I was worried about, like free will and agency, on a par with worries about the end of human life. And I just want to quickly provide data, actually, to suggest that I'm on the right side here. So I'm going to have to see if I can share my screen very quickly with you. Yes, I think I can do it. Can you all see my screen? You should be seeing a Google Ngram viewer. Yeah, people can see
Yes.
this? Okay, good. So what you're looking at here is the word existential charted against words like existential risk and existential threat. You'll see the word existential in the English language picks up about a century ago, and it's correlated with the rise of existential philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre a couple decades later, whereas talk about existential threat and existential risk only appears in the last 15 years. So that was just a little bit of data. That's a little bit cheap. I understand that Matthijs's point was that usually when people use the term existential risk, they are talking about the Terminator scenario where robots kill us all. But my point is that I think that's been a bit of a temporary distraction in the last 15 years. And the worries I have is the original sense of the term existential. That is that this technology is going to force us to confront difficult and uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our place in nature. So I'm just going to insist upon that this is old school existentialism that I'm arguing for.
I take that point. I'm curious whether we'll see an exponential increase in the existential threat, whether we'll have a singularity in the usage of the term. So we'll see how much longer the the older terms will remain prevalent.
So we have a number of questions that have come in, and perhaps I'll start with the first one from Philip McEwen. What is AI aside from machine learning? And what is an existential risk? Would anyone like to respond to that?
Can I?
Stuart, yes.
So as I said, AI is a very ambiguous term. It used to be that we knew what AI was. This was the human in digital form, sort of 80s and before. And then something very odd, it was basically thought that if you had a human that could win on Jeopardy, if you had an AI machine that could win on Jeopardy or drive a car, it would have a general intelligence. It could do lots of things just like humans could do. You needed the full human skills in order to do stuff like that. And it's turned out in this century that that isn't the case. We have narrow AIs that win on Jeopardy, that can drive cars, and we still don't really have anything like a general intelligence. So the old concept that everything in AI went together sort of died out, and now AI has become ambiguous. It doesn't know what it means. It's mainly a marketing tool. When I use it, I tend to use it in the old-fashioned sense. If you want to be more precise, the AGI, the artificial general intelligence, the hypothetical machine that is capable of cross-domain skills and better than humans in pretty much any domain. Existential risk, I'll just mention, it's risks that, Nick Bostrom's definition is risks that threaten human survival or to seriously curtail its potential. We had long debates as to whether we should change the term. It went on forever. We didn't find a better term because this one was already in use. So we're stuck with existential risk. It threatens human existence, basically.
Allan, I think you have a response as well.
Yeah, the difference between AI has to do with feedback and learning. A computer will do what it's programmed to do. An AI learns through feedback and does things that were not originally programmed into the machine. That's what machine learning is all about. It's the way that we learn too. Don't touch the hot stove or you'll burn yourself. You get some pretty immediate feedback and then you learn not to do that again. And so an AI will learn through being wrong what the right answer would be. And that is the difference, the fundamental difference between AI, machine learning on one side, and your average computer on the other.
I'll go to the next question from David Leighton Brown. Is there a threshold, for example, self-awareness, that would change or activate your position? And how would that threshold be defined and measured? And how likely or unlikely is it? Would anyone like to take this question on?
I could, if I don't want to be.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Okay, just answering. The issue of self-awareness and consciousness props up with AI all the time, and people, I don't like to go into it because it's very hard to imagine. The prediction problem is even harder for, is the AI going to be conscious or self-aware in the way that we think, if it exists? And this is why I prefer to focus on skills. So what could the AI do? Could it do this? Could it achieve that? Because that we can talk about successfully in advance, or try and predict or deal with it. I can imagine a super intelligent, super powered AI that doesn't have consciousness or self-awareness in any way that we would recognize. I can also imagine conscious, self-aware AIs that do not have high levels of skills, or that don't pose a threat in any way. I think that the self-awareness and consciousness is disconnected from the threat and power of AI. It's relevant for moral issues of the AI itself, but not for its power level.
Do any of the other debaters wish to comment on the question? Go ahead,
Sure.
Gina.
I tried coming this a little bit. So I think there's if the question here is about whether or not this entity will ever be self-aware, be conscious, my worry is that we will never know, because the problem here is about how we recognize other minds, how we recognize that there's something going on inside of the machine. So however clever the machine might be at producing human language or manipulating objects or making predictions or whatnot, we will always be asking, is there something going on behind it? Is there something it's like to be an AI? Like Stuart said, it might be super clever and there's actually nothing it's like to experience being an AI, or there might be some not so clever AIs that do have phenomenal consciousness, experiences of the world. And I don't know if we'll ever know. The problem here is that historically, when we've had similar questions about, say, non-human animals, the shift isn't so much evidentiary as it is attitudinal. What I mean by that is, once upon a time, if you go back in European history, say around the time of Descartes thought of animals as just like kind of complicated machines. They're automata. And Descartes would seem to think that there was nothing it was like to be an animal, which is not what we tend to think today. We tend to assume animals experience pain. But that shift was less about evidence and more about our living alongside animals, our inviting animals into our homes to be pets rather than to be workers out in the field. And so my prediction is this, which is that in the next couple of decades, we're all going to be saying, oh, well, of course the AI there's nothing it's like to be an AI. It's nothing it's like to be conscious as an AI. And 150 years from now, people will be saying, how could those people have thought these machines weren't conscious, these machines that live alongside us and chat with us all day long and seem to really care what we do to them? How could anyone have ever thought otherwise? And at some point in the next 150 years, that switch is going to happen, but it won't be on the basis of some new evidence. It will be because people have grown up as children around AIs all the time and have come to live with them in their lives. And so that's, like, from a philosophical perspective, the really hard thing is not knowing when that point is going to happen or why it's going to happen.
I also I'd like to jump in on that, because I think I actually also accidentally answered a similar question that was addressed to Gina. But I think that also relates sort of a similar point. Maybe the philosopher John Danner has this sort of theory of what he calls ethical behaviorism, just the sense that we don't assign moral status to other humans based on any, like, our apprehension of their internal, like, oh yeah, I've checked at my sense and it's a you're definitely conscious and therefore I'll treat you like a human. And so his point is that if it behaves in that way like a agent, you cannot ethically deny it the same treatment. But then there are, of course, arguments saying that, well, I think others have argued, from Joanna Bryson or others have argued, that there's no onus on us to commit to bringing those types of beings into being. Then, like, if we have a choice to build systems that act like us, perhaps then there's an argument, if you follow sort of John Danner's and maybe the same claim, that once we create them, we cannot deny them the same treatment, but we have a choice in whether to allow systems to impersonate, or to design systems that impersonate or mimic human behavior.
Does anyone else wish to comment on that question?
Well, it kind of brings up the Turing test, which says that if you can't distinguish between a human being and what a machine does, there's no difference. I'm not sure about that one, but that's certainly a question that we've had for a long time. The appearance of humanity versus the actuality of it. How do you decide?
And we have one more question from Tony G. I think that might be Jenko. Haven't attended a debate in quite some time. Haven't had any question, but wanted to let you know that this has been very enjoyable and stimulating. Well, thank you very much, Tony. I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to anyone that may have taken an opposite point of view from the arguments that they presented, that they might be itching or would really like to respond to. Stuart, that means you'll have to respond to everyone.
If you want.
Actually,
You've got about 2 minutes, so go ahead.
Well, thanks for that. Thanks for this kind of incisive question that really puts pressure. No, thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed it there. And something maybe I should have mentioned in Ruth's talk, I'm definitely not talking about current machine learning techniques, which are not general intelligences and have deep learning is maybe a general method. It's a bit more general than previous methods, but it's nothing close to a general intelligence, which, as this the figures I've shown show, we have no idea when we'll get that. My 90% confidence interval is 5 to 100 years. And yeah, hope everyone enjoyed it, and thanks for all the panelists and for people who invited me.
Perhaps I could abuse my role here as the moderator. And given what you've said, Stuart, in terms of the unpredictability in terms of AI, and you've just gone on the limb to indicate that you think a general AI might emerge within 100 years or so. But given that we are bad at predicting these things, is it possible that there could be a major breakthrough in terms of IA technology that could result in something that is, and I'm not sure how you would define it, but general artificial intelligence that no one can anticipate, that leads to a problem of being able to control it? Presumably you're working on those problems in terms of controlling the evolution and development. But given that people are doing research in this area in different areas, and companies are doing research, someone might make some sort of breakthrough, which is very difficult to predict, of course. Is that a possibility?
Yes. I said 5 to 100 years, and I'm both looking at the 5 and the 100 scenarios. We might get AI unexpectedly. So that's what uncertainty means. It expands both wings of the thing. We might get it unexpectedly fast. I really don't like the singularity concept, and it tends to get people thinking in poor ways, as I said, apocalyptic or utopian. But there might be some merit to the sort of feedback argument to the first trace of general intelligence, because we have a lot of very powerful narrow AIs, and if we had a general intelligence that was capable of networking them together, it might achieve extraordinary capabilities in a very short timeline, and maybe in a timeline sufficiently short that most of the world would not realize it. So yes, the 5 years is definitely also a possibility. It might get here much faster than we think, as well as much slower than we think.
I think also maybe on that point, it's interesting to sort of see that in the history of technology predictions. There's also cases of people perceiving perceiving barriers that end up being quite phantom. So there's been Dreyfus himself extended his critique of AI in sort of like an embodied nature in, I think, the early 2000s or late 90s. He argued that internet search is just categorically impossible. And then 4 years later, Google had its IPO, and in the later editions of his book, I think, On the Internet, those passages are just quietly dropped because people just look back and they're like, and it's like when you read his argument in advance, it's like, oh yeah, that seems plausible. Like there's no way that, like we're already seeing the grinding to a whole of internet search. We'll never really have good URLs in internet search. And so it's interesting to see which barriers are we not seeing and which barriers are we fantasizing, also perhaps because it seems sort of flattering to us. Is like, yeah, general intelligence must need some sort of special sauce. I'm relatively, yeah, pessimistic, but we'll be ready to be surprised.
Okay, thank you. We have one last thing to do before we close this McLaughlin College Union debate, and that's our poll. So Andrew, if you're still with us, could you administer the poll? So I invite all of our participants to respond to the proposition, either for or against. And you have about 18. I think it's a minute or 2 minutes. I'm not sure exactly the amount of time that you have.
Wow, it's like the US presidential election results. It's just, you know, coming down to the wire here. Got 70.
We're not going to do any recounts, so not to worry, Gina. Some people are still taking their time to make up their mind.
I think if nobody else votes, I think that means Stuart wins.
or everyone wins. Well, I think we've pretty well exhausted this. I think you can all see the results of the poll on your screen. A perfect result. Evenly divided. So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. I want to thank all of the people that came and participated in this debate, and specifically, of course, our debaters. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us for this. I've also personally found it very enlightening and interesting. Thank you very much. I now greatly anticipate seeing what will develop in the AI field over the next 5 years, given Stuart's prediction. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm inviting everyone, particularly students who are interested in the McLaughlin College Union, to contact me if you'd like to get involved in the McLaughlin College Union. And I'd like to invite everyone back to our next debate, which will be held in the new year, and we will announce the topic. It's going to be hopefully as stimulating and interesting as our last two. So thank you, everyone, and we'll end the McLaughlin College Union debate for today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.